And the truth that very few people come to terms with early is this. Understanding a narcissist doesn't automatically free you. Learning their behavior patterns doesn't break the cycle. Even trying to outthink them or use similar tactics rarely leads anywhere meaningful. The reason is simple. This is not someone experimenting with harmful behavior from time to time. This is a deeply ingrained personality structure, built over years, designed around emotional control, attention extraction, and psychological dominance long before you ever cross their path. What you are dealing with is not just bad behavior, it's a system, one that feeds on emotional reactions, mental energy, and identity disruption. And the longer you stay engaged in trying to decode it, the more it quietly keeps you tied to it. But there is something they never openly want you to recognize. What actually reduces their influence over you is not revenge. It is not confrontation, exposure, or winning arguments. Those things often keep you locked in the same emotional loop. What truly shifts the dynamic is far more subtle and far more powerful. A psychological withdrawal that removes the very fuel their identity depends on. Once you begin to understand that structure, you stop focusing on their control and start recognizing where your real leverage has always been. Not in anger, not in retaliation, but in awareness. This is not about becoming like them or learning manipulation tactics. It is about learning how to remove yourself as a source of emotional supply. When you apply even a small part of this shift consistently, something noticeable begins to change. Not because you attacked them, but because you stopped participating in the emotional exchange they rely on. That withdrawal alone can destabilize the dynamic because the system was never built to function without your engagement. Before going deeper into the methods, one core reality has to be understood clearly. The narcissistic structure is not built like a stable, integrated self. Beneath the surface confidence, the image management, and the outward certainty, there is often internal fragmentation. What exists is not a grounded identity, but a constructed version of self, built as protection against early emotional wounds like shame, rejection, or deep insecurity. That self is not naturally stable. It requires reinforcement. It needs constant reflection from others, admiration, attention, reaction, emotional investment to stay intact. Without that external input, the internal structure starts to feel unstable, even empty. This is why relationships become so central in this dynamic. Other people are not just companions, they become regulators of identity. Every reaction you give, whether it is affection, fear, explanation, frustration, or even attempts to fix things, feeds into that system. It confirms importance. It maintains emotional centrality. It reinforces the role they unconsciously depend on. Over time, this creates a pattern where your emotional energy becomes part of their internal stability. And the more you adapt, explain, or react, the more central you become in sustaining that cycle. This is the hidden mechanism behind the dynamic. And it is also why the most effective shift is not louder behavior, but quieter detachment. The methods that follow all work on different layers of that system. One reduces emotional access. Another disrupts the image they try to maintain. Another removes attention as a form of reinforcement. And another cuts off the ongoing emotional supply they depend on. Together, they don't create conflict. They create distance. And importantly, none of this requires confrontation. In fact, confrontation often strengthens the cycle because it keeps emotional engagement alive. What actually shifts the balance is calm neutrality, a version of you that is no longer emotionally reactive in the same way. That kind of presence is difficult for this dynamic to handle because it removes the feedback loop it depends on. It is not anger they struggle with. Anger is familiar. It is emotional detachment that creates the real disruption. And this is where everything begins to shift at the level of your energy, attention, and mental focus. The resources you have been unconsciously directing toward them start returning back to you. To see how deeply this plays out, think about how the relationship typically operated day to day. Even before your day fully began, part of your awareness was already oriented toward them. You were anticipating mood shifts, trying to predict emotional tone, preparing responses in advance, and adjusting yourself based on subtle cues. Their emotional state often set the atmosphere for your entire day. You might have hesitated before speaking, carefully chosen your words, or monitored their expressions to avoid triggering conflict. Over time, this stops feeling like a choice and starts becoming automatic. Your nervous system adapts to unpredictability by staying alert. It begins scanning for signs, reading silence, interpreting tone, and preparing for shifts before they even happen. This constant internal monitoring becomes exhausting, but it also becomes familiar. And in that process, something significant happens quietly. Your attention gets redirected away from yourself and consistently toward them. Even in their absence, they remain mentally present. While working, resting, or trying to disconnect, part of your mind continues processing them, what they meant, what they might do next, how they feel, what changed, what didn't. They did not naturally earn that level of mental space. It was gradually conditioned through cycles of warmth and withdrawal, clarity and confusion, connection and distance. That inconsistency creates emotional fixation. The mind tries to resolve what keeps shifting. And without realizing it, your internal world starts revolving around tracking someone else's emotional patterns instead of staying grounded in your own life. This is the foundation of the dynamic. And once you begin to see it clearly, the direction of change becomes obvious. The shift is not about doing more, but about reclaiming what has been steadily taken: your attention, your emotional bandwidth, and your inner stability. Now comes a crucial turning point in understanding all of this. The first method is not about simply ignoring them. It is not about acting indifferent while internally spiraling. It is not the silent treatment while your emotions remain fully entangled underneath. Those are still forms of engagement, just expressed differently. And narcissistic dynamics are extremely sensitive to emotional energy because reading subtle emotional shifts has always been part of how that system operates. Even when you try to hide your reactions, if your body is still tense, if your thoughts are still consumed, if your inner world is still revolving around them, that energy is often still readable. And as long as they can sense emotional attachment, they still feel significant in your internal world. What actually begins to dissolve their influence is something far more grounded. It is not performance. It is not strategy. It is an internal realignment, a quiet but firm decision where they are no longer placed at the center of your emotional life. You stop organizing your days around their moods. You stop filtering your choices through anticipation of their reactions. You slowly begin redirecting your attention back to yourself, your thoughts, your direction, your recovery, your life that existed before and can exist again without them occupying constant mental space. This shift is not loud or dramatic. It happens through consistent redirection of energy, a gradual return of focus from them back to you. But this process often begins with something many people resist because it feels uncomfortable to face: grief. Not anger disguised as strength, not obsessive analysis mistaken for healing, but real emotional grief. The quiet acceptance that something you believed in was not what it appeared to be. The realization that the version of them you connected to in the beginning was not fully authentic in the way you thought it was, but partially constructed, an emotional presentation designed to create attachment. And alongside that comes another difficult truth. The relationship you experienced was not equally built on love from both sides. For you, it may have been emotional, genuine, and meaningful. But for them, it often operated through control, validation, and emotional exchange rather than mutual depth. Grieving this reality is not a sign of weakness. It is a necessary emotional passage, because until this grief is fully processed, a part of you remains stuck in expectation, still hoping, still waiting, still emotionally reaching for a version of them that only existed at the beginning or in moments of performance. And that unresolved attachment keeps the cycle alive internally, even when the relationship itself is no longer stable. But once that grief is truly allowed to settle, something begins to change quietly. The emotional intensity starts to fade. Not suddenly, but gradually. You stop replaying conversations repeatedly in your mind. You stop trying to decode meaning from behavior that was never consistent to begin with. You stop waiting for clarity, closure, or apologies that were never going to arrive in the form you needed. And in that emotional quietness, something important begins to return to you. Your own internal space, your focus, your clarity, your sense of direction. This is where the shift becomes noticeable in behavior, even if you never announce it. You are no longer internally reactive in the same way. Their presence does not trigger the same emotional spike. You are no longer trying to appear calm while internally overwhelmed. You stop over-explaining. You stop over-apologizing. You stop adjusting your behavior constantly just to maintain emotional stability in the environment. Not because you forced yourself into discipline, but because the emotional dependency that once made those reactions automatic is beginning to dissolve. And narcissistic dynamics register this quickly. They are highly sensitive to changes in emotional availability. When the flow of attention, reaction, and emotional investment begins to decrease, it is often felt immediately. The internal supply they rely on no longer feels as steady, and that shift creates discomfort. In response, they often test the connection. They may provoke, they may escalate tension, they may become unusually charming again, suddenly attentive, or even act wounded or confused. The purpose behind these shifts is not genuine resolution. It is re-engagement. It is an attempt to pull you back into the familiar emotional loop where your reactions once gave the dynamic its stability. And in those moments, your role is not to engage or counterattack, but to stay aware, to recognize what is happening without being pulled into it, not through emotional suppression, not through coldness, but through grounded presence. A calm awareness that no longer surrenders control of your internal state to external behavior. Because at its core, the power in this dynamic was never entirely theirs. It was something they were able to use because it was being offered repeatedly through attention, emotional investment, explanation, fear, hope, and reaction. The influence they held over your emotional world was not self-generated. It was sustained through your participation in it. And the moment that participation begins to change, the structure itself begins to weaken. Not because of conflict, but because of withdrawal. Taking your energy back is not an act of opposition. It is an act of return, a quiet reclamation of what was always yours. And when that begins to happen consistently, the dynamic does not escalate into something stronger. It starts to lose its foundation. The system does not collapse because it is attacked. It collapses because it is no longer being fed. And once that shift begins, what follows is the next layer of this process. The point where the constructed image they depend on begins to reveal its limits. Because when emotional supply decreases, the false self does not quietly fade. It becomes more active. It intensifies the performance. It pushes harder to be seen, validated, believed, and emotionally reinforced. And this is where the second method becomes essential, because underneath all of this behavior lies a structure that depends entirely on maintaining an image that feels stable, superior, and unquestioned. The narcissistic identity is not just confidence. It is a carefully maintained narrative, a story about being exceptional, misunderstood, superior, victimized, or uniquely valuable. The details may shift, but the purpose remains constant, to protect a fragile internal structure from collapse. And anything that threatens that story is not processed as reality. It is reframed, denied, or redirected outward. Because beneath the image is something far more unstable than it appears. At its core, this operates as a survival-based psychological structure. It is not simply a set of behaviors or surface-level reactions, but a deeply organized internal system built to preserve identity stability, emotional safety, and perceived control over one's environment. That is what makes it both powerful and fragile at the same time. Powerful because it can adapt quickly, reframe situations, and protect itself from immediate emotional threat. Fragile because its stability depends on maintaining a very specific internal narrative, one that cannot tolerate sustained contradiction without strain. The more tightly a system depends on preserving a constructed version of reality, the more sensitive it becomes to anything that introduces inconsistency. And this is where most people misunderstand the dynamic. They assume they are dealing with ordinary defensiveness, when in reality they are interacting with a structure that is constantly working to prevent internal collapse. That means even small disruptions are not processed as neutral information. They are processed as threats to coherence. And once something is perceived as a threat to coherence, the response is no longer proportional to the event itself, but to the level of internal destabilization it creates. You may have already seen this fragility in real situations without fully labeling it at the time, moments where you tried to calmly point out inconsistencies, highlight contradictions, or gently bring attention to something that did not fully add up across different versions of a story. From your perspective, these were reasonable attempts at clarity, efforts to align perception with reality. On the surface, it seemed like a normal conversation should follow, where both sides adjust, clarify, and move toward understanding. But what actually happened rarely stayed within that frame. Instead, there was often a sudden emotional shift that felt disproportionate to the original topic. Defensiveness would escalate quickly, sometimes almost instantly, as if a switch had been flipped. Silence would follow that did not feel neutral, but heavy and punishing. Or there would be a complete reversal of roles, where the focus was turned back onto you, reframing you as the problem, too critical, too confusing, too aggressive, or somehow responsible for the discomfort that emerged. In those moments, the content of the conversation stopped mattering. What mattered was the protection of the internal narrative, because the challenge was never just about facts, it was about something deeper being touched, the stability of self-image, and the structure that holds it together. This is exactly why direct confrontation so often fails in these dynamics. When you approach with emotional intensity, whether through frustration, urgency, or visible disagreement, you are not breaking the system, you are feeding it usable material. Emotional reactions become evidence that can be reinterpreted, redirected, and used to shift the frame of the conversation away from the original issue. Suddenly, the focus is no longer on what was said or what actually happened. It becomes about your tone, your reaction, your misunderstanding, or your supposed instability. The narrative subtly changes shape, allowing the original inconsistency to disappear behind a new storyline, where your emotional response becomes the central problem. This is how control is often reestablished without resolving anything substantive. Many people get trapped in this loop without realizing it. They enter the conversation with the intention of clarity or resolution, but leave feeling mentally exhausted, confused, and internally destabilized, as if they participated in a discussion where the rules were never stable to begin with. Over time, this creates a pattern where engagement itself becomes draining because every attempt at truth is absorbed into a shifting narrative system that resists accountability by continuously reframing the context. The alternative approach operates on a completely different principle. Instead of engaging the constructed image directly through emotional resistance, you begin introducing reality in a calm, neutral, and non-performative way. Not as a weapon, not as a correction meant to dominate, but as a form of quiet clarity that does not escalate the emotional field. In this mode, you become less like an opponent and more like a mirror, reflecting what is present without distortion or emotional charge. A mirror does not argue, does not persuade, and does not collapse under pressure. It simply reflects. Practically, this means you stop entering the extremes of agreement or confrontation and instead occupy a steady middle ground where reality is gently anchored into the conversation. For example, when a narrative is presented in a way that exaggerates success, minimizes responsibility, or reshapes timelines for emotional comfort, you do not react with disbelief or accusation. Instead, you introduce grounded reference points in a calm tone. How does that align with what was happening around that time? Or wasn't that already decided earlier in the process? Or even, that's interesting, I remember it unfolding a bit differently. The key is not the wording itself, but the absence of emotional charge. There is no urgency to win, no need to expose, no desire to overpower. Just the quiet presence of consistency placed beside distortion. Over time, this creates a subtle cognitive disruption. The narrative can still be maintained, but it is no longer seamless. Small gaps appear where certainty used to be automatic. And in those gaps, awareness begins to form, not as confrontation, but as recognition that the story is no longer fully unchallenged. As this approach continues consistently, escalation often follows before any visible change occurs. When emotional strategies such as guilt, charm, withdrawal, anger, or sudden reconciliation no longer produce the same predictable responses, other mechanisms may surface. These can include subtle references to personal vulnerabilities, previously shared insecurities, or emotionally charged framing designed to destabilize your internal state again. From the outside, this can feel like a regression or an intensification of conflict, but internally it is better understood as a reaction to reduced influence. The system is adjusting to a loss of effectiveness in its usual tools. However, this stage should not be misinterpreted as failure of your approach. In many cases, escalation is not a sign that the method is not working, but that it is beginning to work too consistently to be ignored. The structure resists most strongly right before it weakens. And in that phase, the most important response is not counter-escalation, but steadiness. Remaining grounded, emotionally regulated, and connected to what is objectively real becomes essential. Not as resistance in the emotional sense, but as consistency in perception. Because systems built on narrative control are not designed to function well under sustained clarity. They rely on emotional participation, ambiguity, and reactive engagement. When those elements are no longer available, the structure loses its ability to fully stabilize the distortion. Eventually, there is a quieter phase that begins to emerge, one that is often only recognized in hindsight. It is not dramatic or immediately obvious, but it marks a meaningful internal shift. The emotional fog that once made conflicting narratives feel coherent begins to thin. Statements that previously felt absolute, such as being the problem, being too sensitive, or being responsible for every breakdown, start to lose their emotional authority. They may still be heard, but they no longer land with the same certainty or internal weight. Something within perception begins to separate from the imposed narrative. Clarity is not yet fully formed, but doubt begins to shift direction, not toward self-blame, but toward reevaluation of the entire dynamic. This is the point where the illusion is no longer total. And once that boundary is crossed, even faintly, it cannot fully return to its original intensity. The structure may still attempt to reassert itself, but the internal acceptance that once sustained it is no longer complete. What remains is a gradual return to grounded perception, where reality is no longer filtered entirely through emotional distortion, but begins to stand on its own again. In the end, nothing about this journey is really about defeating someone else. It is about stepping out of a psychological loop that was built through confusion, emotional intensity, and repeated cycles of hope and disappointment. What once felt like power from them slowly reveals itself as something else entirely. A structure that only worked because of your attention, your emotional energy, and your willingness to keep engaging with a version of reality that was never stable to begin with. And when that engagement begins to fade, the entire dynamic changes, not through confrontation, not through revenge, but through withdrawal, through clarity, through the simple act of no longer feeding what was feeding on you. You start to notice it first in small ways. The emotional reactions no longer pull you in the same direction. The urgency begins to fade. The need to explain, fix, prove, or win slowly loses its grip. And in its place, something quieter begins to grow. Stability, awareness, and distance from emotional chaos that once felt normal. And eventually, you reach a point where the most powerful shift has already happened without noise or announcement. You are no longer centered around them in your thoughts, your decisions, or your emotional state. The internal space they once occupied is no longer available in the same way. That is the real conclusion of everything here. Not victory over someone else, but return to yourself. Because once you are no longer participating in the cycle, there is nothing left for it to sustain.